They were told the Americans would torture them, burn them alive, use them for experiments like animals in cages. But when the Imperial Japanese Army nurse named Kimiko and her friend Yuki stepped off the transport truck onto Okinawan soil in April 1945, what broke them wasn't cruelty. It was a chocolate bar, a clean bandage, and a medic who said two words they never expected to hear. "You're safe." They had prepared for death. They had been trained to die rather than surrender. Yet here they stood, enemies in American hands, waiting for the violence that never came. Instead, something far more dangerous arrived, something that would shatter everything they believed about honor, duty, and the enemy they'd been taught to hate. If stories like this move you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. These forgotten moments of history deserve to be remembered. The island of Okinawa burned. Smoke rose in thick black columns from shattered villages and splintered palm trees. The ground shook with artillery fire, and the air tasted of sulfur and death. It was late April 1945, and the Battle of Okinawa had turned the island into hell on earth. In a cave hidden beneath coral rock and tangled roots, 23 Japanese women huddled together in the darkness. They were nurses, volunteers with the Imperial Army's medical corps, young women barely out of their teens who had signed up to serve the Emperor with pride burning in their hearts. Now that pride had turned to ash. Their white uniforms, once crisp and clean, were brown with dried blood and mud. Their faces were hollow, their eyes wide with exhaustion and terror. The sounds of battle had grown closer over the past 3 days. American voices echoed through the tunnels. Boots crunched on gravel. Flashlight beams cut through the cave's darkness like knives. The women knew what was coming. Their officers had told them again and again, surrender means shame worse than death. The Americans are devils. They will torture you, rape you, murder you slowly. Better to die with honor than to live in disgrace. Kimiko sat against the damp cave wall, her arm around her best friend Yuki. They had grown up together in a small farming village outside Hiroshima. They had attended nursing school together, volunteered together, and arrived on Okinawa together 6 months earlier. Back then, the war had seemed distant, almost romantic. They would serve the Emperor, save soldiers' lives, and return home as heroes. That dream had died somewhere between the screaming wounded and the smell of gangrene. Now, as American voices grew louder outside the cave entrance, Kimiko felt Yuki's body trembling against her. "They're here," Yuki whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of Kimiko's own heart. "It's time." The cave smelled of sweat, blood, and the metallic tang of fear. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, each drop marking the seconds before their deaths. Some of the women had already swallowed cyanide capsules given to them by their commanding officer. Others clutched grenades, waiting for the Americans to storm inside so they could take enemies with them into death. Kimiko's fingers found the small capsule in her pocket. It felt heavier than it should. This tiny pill that promised escape from dishonor. Beside her, Yuki coughed, a deep, wet sound that had been getting worse for days. In the dim light filtering in from the cave mouth, Kimiko could see dark stains on Yuki's uniform. Blood. Her friend had been struck by shrapnel 3 days ago, and without proper medicine, the wound had turned septic. "Kimiko," Yuki breathed, gripping her friend's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me. When they come, don't let them take me alive. Please." Before Kimiko could answer, a voice boomed from outside the cave. The words were incomprehensible, foreign, harsh, American English. The women pressed themselves deeper into the shadows, some weeping silently, others praying to ancestors for courage in their final moments. Then came the sound every woman dreaded, boots on stone moving into the cave. Flashlight beams swept across the huddled figures. A woman near the entrance screamed and lunged forward with a broken piece of glass. Gunfire cracked through the cave, deafening in the enclosed space. But the bullets didn't hit her. Instead, they struck the cave ceiling, sending rock dust raining down. "Stop! We won't hurt you." The English words meant nothing to most of the women, but the tone was strange, not aggressive, almost pleading. American soldiers appeared at the cave entrance, their rifles raised but not firing. They were huge, these Americans, tall and broad-shouldered, their faces dirty and tired. They looked like the monsters from the propaganda posters, but their eyes were different. Wary, yes, frightened even, but not cruel. One soldier lowered his rifle and held up both hands, palms out. "It's okay," he said in broken Japanese, the words clearly memorized. "No hurt. No hurt you." The women stared in frozen disbelief. This wasn't how the enemy was supposed to behave. Where was the violence? The brutality they'd been warned about? Kimiko felt Yuki go limp in her arms. Her friend's eyes had rolled back, her breathing shallow and rapid. The infection was winning. Without medical care, Yuki would be dead within hours. And in that moment, as American soldiers cautiously entered the cave and the propaganda crumbled against reality, Kimiko made a choice that would change everything. She stood up, pulling Yuki with her, and in desperate, broken English learned from a schoolbook years ago, she screamed the only words she could remember. "Please, help, she's dying, please." The cave fell silent. All eyes, Japanese and American, turned to the two women stumbling toward the soldiers, toward the enemy, toward the impossible. What happened next would replay in Kimiko's mind for the rest of her life, each detail sharp as broken glass. The American soldiers froze as she stumbled forward, Yuki's dead weight pulling them both down. For a heartbeat, Kimiko thought they would shoot. She had broken from the group, moved toward them suddenly. Every instinct must have screamed danger to these battle-weary men. Instead, one soldier, young, his face smudged with dirt and stubble, dropped his rifle entirely and lunged forward to catch them as they fell. "Medic!" he shouted. "Medic, we got wounded here." Wounded, not enemy, not prisoner, wounded. Kimiko landed hard on her knees, cradling Yuki's unconscious form. The American soldier knelt beside them, his hands hovering uncertainly, clearly wanting to help, but not sure how to touch them without causing fear. Another soldier appeared, this one with a red cross on his helmet. The medic. He took one look at Yuki's blood-soaked uniform and immediately began barking orders. Within seconds, more Americans surrounded them. Hands, surprisingly gentle hands, lifted Yuki from Kimiko's arms. She tried to hold on, terrified they would take her friend away, finish what the battle had started. "No, no take, I stay with her." Kimiko heard herself shouting, the English words tumbling out in desperate fragments. The medic looked at her, really looked at her, and his face softened. "You can stay," he said slowly, gesturing for her to follow. "Come, help her, friend, understand? Friend." Friend. The word hung in the air between enemy nations, between propaganda and reality. Kimiko nodded frantically and stumbled after them as they carried Yuki out of the cave, into the blinding sunlight of the Okinawan afternoon. The American field hospital was chaos made orderly. Tents stretched in rows across a cleared area, sandbags piled around perimeters, and everywhere the smell of antiseptic fighting with the stench of war. Wounded American soldiers lay on stretchers, some groaning, some eerily silent, and now among them they laid Yuki on a clean white cot. Kimiko stood frozen, watching American medics swarm around her dying friend. This wasn't supposed to happen. Enemy wounded were supposed to be left to die, or worse. That's what the officers had promised. That's what the propaganda had shown. Americans as savage beasts who took pleasure in Japanese suffering. But these men worked with urgent efficiency. One medic cut away Yuki's ruined uniform while another prepared an IV. A doctor appeared. She knew he was a doctor by the way others deferred to him, and bent over Yuki, examining the infected wound on her side with serious eyes. "Septic shock," he said to the medics. "We need sulfa drugs, plasma, and get that wound cleaned out now. She's got maybe hours if we don't move fast." They were going to try to save her. These Americans, these supposed devils, were actually going to try to save a Japanese soldier's life. Kimiko's legs went weak. A hand caught her elbow, steadying her. She looked up into the face of a female nurse, an American woman with kind eyes and dirt under her fingernails. The nurse guided Kimiko to a stool beside Yuki's cot and pressed a canteen into her hands. "Drink," the nurse said gently, miming the action. "You're dehydrated." The water was clean. Cold. It was the most beautiful thing Kimiko had tasted in months. She drank deeply, then stopped, guilty. She was supposed to be dead. She was supposed to have died with honor in that cave. Instead, she was drinking the enemy's water while they saved her friend's life. What kind of world was this? The doctor worked quickly, cutting away dead tissue from Yuki's wound while a medic held her down. Even unconscious, Yuki moaned in pain. Kimiko reached out and gripped her friend's hand, whispering in Japanese, "Hold on, please hold on. They're helping us. I don't understand it, but they're helping us." An hour passed, then two. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Kimiko of fire. Around them, the hospital continued its grim work. American soldiers died despite the doctor's best efforts. Others clung to life by threads. And in the midst of all this American suffering, the medical team had devoted precious resources to saving a Japanese woman. Finally, the doctor stepped back, stripping off bloodied gloves. He looked exhausted but satisfied. "She'll make it," he told the nurse. "The infection was bad, but we caught it in time. She's young and strong. She'll pull through." The nurse translated into simple Japanese, speaking slowly so Kimiko could understand. When the words sank in, when Kimiko realized Yuki would live, she did something she had sworn she would never do in front of the enemy. She wept. Great shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. She bent over Yuki's still form, her tears falling on her friend's hand, and cried for everything. For the terror of the cave, for the shock of mercy, for the collapse of everything she thought she knew about honor and war and the nature of her enemy. The American nurse knelt beside her and did something even more shocking. She pulled Kimiko into an embrace, holding her as she cried, murmuring soft words in English that Kimiko couldn't understand but whose meaning was universal. You're safe now. It's okay. You're safe. As darkness fell, more women from the cave were brought to the American lines. Some came willingly, seeing that Kimiko and Yuki had not been killed. Others had to be carried, unconscious from cyanide attempts that hadn't worked or injuries from their days hiding in the caves. A few had died in the cave, choosing death over the dishonor of surrender. Those who survived found themselves in a bewildering new reality. The Americans separated them from the male prisoners, for protection, they would later learn, not for punishment. They were given water, food, and medical examinations. Those with injuries were treated alongside American wounded. Those who were healthy were deloused, given clean clothes, and assigned to tents with cots and blankets. Kimiko stayed by Yuki's side as her friend drifted in and out of feverish consciousness. Each time Yuki woke, she seemed surprised to find herself alive, even more surprised to see American medics checking her bandages and adjusting her IV. "Are we dead?" Yuki whispered once, her eyes glassy with fever and morphine. "Is this the afterlife?" "No," Kimiko answered, gripping her friend's hand. "We're alive, and the Americans... Yuki, they saved you. They actually saved you." Yuki's eyes filled with tears. "That's impossible. The lieutenant said..." "I know what the lieutenant said. He was wrong. They were all wrong." Around them in the medical tent, other Japanese women whispered among themselves, their voices filled with confusion and disbelief. The propaganda had painted such a clear picture of American savagery, but reality was offering them something completely different. Mercy they didn't deserve, care they hadn't earned, and a glimpse of humanity in the face of the enemy. As Kimiko settled onto a cot beside Yuki's bed, wrapped in a clean American blanket that smelled of soap, she felt the first crack in the armor of her beliefs. It was a small crack, barely noticeable, but it was there. And in the days to come, that crack would become a chasm. 3 days after their capture, Yuki was well enough to walk. The fever had broken, the wound was clean, and the American doctors pronounced her on the road to recovery. She and Kimiko were transferred from the field hospital to a prisoner of war camp further inland, away from the active fighting. The camp was a collection of tents surrounded by barbed wire, but it wasn't the nightmare they'd been told to expect. Guard towers stood at corners, yes, and American soldiers patrolled the perimeter with rifles, but the atmosphere inside was strangely calm, almost mundane. Each morning began at dawn with a wake-up call. Not harsh shouting, but a simple bell. The women would rise from their cots, actual cots with mattresses and blankets, and line up for breakfast. The food alone was shocking. Rice, yes, but also bread, canned meat, vegetables, and fruit. Coffee or tea. Sometimes there was powdered milk or sugar. "We eat better here than we did as nurses in the Imperial Army," one woman whispered to Kimiko as they sat on benches in the mess tent. "How is this possible?" Kimiko had no answer. She watched American soldiers moving through the camp, supervising the food distribution, checking on sick prisoners, enforcing rules but not with brutality, with efficiency. They treated the Japanese women like prisoners, yes, but also like human beings deserving of basic dignity. After breakfast came work assignments. Some women were put to work in the camp kitchen, helping prepare meals. Others did laundry or cleaned the facilities. A few who spoke English were brought in to help translate for other prisoners still being processed from caves and bunkers across Okinawa. Kimiko was assigned to the camp infirmary, helping the American medical staff care for sick and injured prisoners. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was nursing Japanese wounded, but under American supervision, with American medicines, following American procedures that actually seemed to work better than what she'd been taught. Yuki, still recovering, was excused from work duty. She spent her days sitting in the shade of the tents, watching the strange new world they'd fallen into with wide, wondering eyes. 2 weeks after their capture, the mail system started functioning. The Americans, following Geneva Convention rules, allowed prisoners to write letters home and receive letters from Japan, though everything was censored, read by both sides. The first letter Kimiko received from her mother broke her heart in ways the war never had. "My daughter," it read in her mother's careful handwriting, "we received word you were captured. Your father wept. He says you are dead to us now, that you have brought shame on our family. I do not know what to think. I pray you found the courage to die with honor rather than live in disgrace. The village is starving. American bombs destroyed the rice fields. We boil grass for soup and fight the dogs for scraps. Your little brother grows thinner each day. If you have any food, if the Americans allow it, please send what you can. We are desperate." Kimiko read the letter 3 times, each word cutting deeper. She sat in the shade of the tent, staring at the half-eaten lunch on her plate, fresh bread, canned peaches, a piece of chocolate she'd saved from yesterday, and felt the full weight of the contradiction settle on her shoulders. Here in captivity, she had more than she'd had serving her own army. She slept in a clean bed. She ate 3 meals a day. She had soap, medicine, safety. Meanwhile, her family, loyal citizens of the Empire, were starving. Her brother was wasting away, and her father had disowned her for the shame of surviving. Around her, other women received similar letters. The camp was soon filled with quiet weeping as the prisoners learned the truth about life back home. Japan was losing the war, badly. Cities were being firebombed. Food was scarce. The government had started training children and old people to fight the expected American invasion with bamboo spears. "They will sacrifice everyone before admitting defeat," said an older woman named Sachiko, a former schoolteacher who'd been nursing wounded on Okinawa when captured. "The Empire would rather see every Japanese person dead than surrender." "But we surrendered," Yuki said quietly, her voice haunted. "We chose life over honor. Doesn't that make us traitors?" Silence fell over the group. It was the question they all wrestled with in the dark hours of night. They had been taught that death was preferable to capture, that surrender meant eternal shame, that the Americans would treat them worse than animals. But reality kept contradicting the propaganda. The contradictions appeared in small moments, unexpected kindnesses that accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone. There was Private Johnson, a young soldier from somewhere called Georgia, who was assigned to guard their section of camp. He couldn't have been more than 20, with red hair and freckles and a photograph of a girl he called my sweetheart that he showed to anyone who would look. He brought extra chocolate from his rations and left it where the women could find it, pretending not to notice when they took it. There was Nurse Patterson, the same woman who had held Kimiko while she cried in the field hospital. She visited the camp regularly to check on recovering patients, and she always brought small gifts, a comb, a mirror, ribbons for hair. Useless things, perhaps, but they made the women feel human again. There was Sergeant Martinez, who had lost a brother at Pearl Harbor, but still treated the Japanese prisoners with firm respect. He enforced the rules strictly but fairly, never with cruelty. When a woman tried to hurt herself, unable to bear the shame of capture, it was Martinez who talked her down from the attempt and sat with her for hours afterward, speaking in broken Japanese about his own struggles with the war. These moments accumulated, creating cracks in the fortress of hatred the women had been taught to build. One afternoon, Kimiko was working in the infirmary when a young American soldier was brought in with a severe fever. She recognized him immediately. It was the same soldier who had caught her and Yuki when they stumbled out of the cave, the one who had shouted for a medic. He was delirious, mumbling about someone named Bobby and Mom's apple pie. His face was flushed with fever and his hands shook. Malaria, the American doctor diagnosed. He would need round-the-clock care. Kimiko volunteered to help nurse him. The other Japanese women looked at her like she'd gone mad. "He's the enemy," one hissed. "Why would you care if he lives or dies?" "He saved Yuki's life," Kimiko answered simply. "Now I'll help save his." For 3 days she sat by his bedside, cooling his fever with damp cloths, helping him drink water, changing his sweat-soaked sheets. She didn't speak English well enough to have real conversations, but she learned his name was David, and he came from a place called Ohio, where his family farmed corn. When the fever finally broke and David opened his eyes to find Kimiko wiping his forehead with a cool cloth, his face went through a series of emotions. Confusion, recognition, and finally something that looked like gratitude. "You," he croaked, his voice hoarse. "From the cave. You're the one who asked for help." Kimiko nodded, understanding his tone if not all his words. David tried to sit up, failed, and settled back with a weak smile. "Thank you," he said clearly. Then in badly pronounced Japanese learned from a phrase book, "Arigato." "Thank you." The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Enemy and enemy, showing gratitude to each other for the simple act of preserving life. It should have been impossible. According to everything they'd been taught, it was impossible. Yet here it was, happening anyway. At night, the women would gather in their tent and talk in hushed voices. These conversations became a kind of therapy, a way to process the cognitive dissonance that threatened to break them. "The Emperor said Americans were demons," one woman said. "But demons don't give you medicine. Demons don't save your life." "Maybe the Emperor was wrong," another whispered, then clapped a hand over her mouth as if she'd spoken the worst blasphemy. "Maybe all of them were wrong," Sachiko said, her voice steady despite the dangerous words. "The generals, the officers, the government, maybe they lied to us about everything." "But why?" Yuki asked, still weak from her ordeal. "Why would they lie?" "Because the truth is dangerous," Kimiko said quietly, thinking of Private Johnson's chocolate and Nurse Patterson's combs and Sergeant Martinez's patient kindness. "The truth is that Americans are people, just people, like us. And if we knew that, we might not be willing to die for the Emperor's war." The tent fell silent. Outside, they could hear American guards making their rounds, boots crunching on gravel. In the distance, artillery rumbled as the Battle of Okinawa continued. Men were still dying out there, Japanese and American both, while in this strange pocket of calm, former enemies were learning to see each other as human. It was Yuki who finally spoke what they were all thinking. If we had known the truth, would we have volunteered? Would we have come to Okinawa at all? No one answered, but the silence was answer enough. The transformation was beginning, slow but inexorable. Each meal, each medical treatment, each small kindness from American guards was eroding the foundation of everything they'd believed. They had been told Americans were subhuman monsters. Reality was showing them something far more dangerous. Americans were human. Flawed, tired, sometimes scared, but fundamentally human. And if Americans were human, then what did that say about the empire that had painted them as demons? What did it say about the officers who had ordered them to die rather than surrender? What did it say about the entire system they had devoted their lives to serving? These were dangerous questions, treasonous questions. But in the quiet of the POW camp, surrounded by barbed wire and enemy soldiers who treated them with more dignity than their own army had, the women couldn't stop asking them. The crack in Kimiko's beliefs was widening into a chasm, and she wasn't alone. She could see it in Yuki's eyes, in Sachiko's thoughtful silences, in the way more women started volunteering to help in the infirmary or kitchen, finding purpose in cooperation rather than resistance. They were still prisoners. They were still the enemy. But something fundamental was shifting, and there would be no going back to the comfortable certainties of propaganda once you'd seen the truth. 6 weeks into captivity, Kimiko woke from a nightmare. In the dream, she was back in the cave, but this time when the Americans appeared, she welcomed them with open arms. Her Imperial Army uniform fell away, revealing American clothes underneath. She was laughing, eating chocolate, while behind her father's face twisted in disgust and shame. She sat up in her cot, breathing hard, her heart racing. Around her, other women slept fitfully, many no doubt fighting their own battles with guilt and confusion. Who was she now? Not a loyal subject of the Empire. She had surrendered, had chosen life over honor. But not American either, despite the way she'd begun to trust some of them. She existed in a liminal space, neither one thing nor another, and it was tearing her apart. The letters from home made it worse. Her mother's latest letter had been harsh. Your father refuses to speak your name. He has performed funeral rites for you. In our hearts you died the day you surrendered. Do not write again. It brings too much pain. Kimiko had cried over that letter, but her tears had been complicated. Grief for her father's rejection, yes, but also anger. Anger at an empire that valued death over life, that would rather she had died in agony from infected wounds than live to see another sunrise. Yuki's family had sent a different kind of letter. Her parents were confused, hurt, but still loving. We don't understand why you surrendered, her mother wrote, but we are glad you are alive. Whatever shame you feel, you are still our daughter. Come home when you can. The difference between the two letters highlighted the arbitrary nature of their situation. Two women, same circumstances, but one family chose shame while the other chose love. Which response was more Japanese? Which honored their culture better? These questions consumed the camp. The women divided into rough groups, those who still clung to the old beliefs and saw their survival as shameful, those who had begun to question everything, and those in the middle, confused and seeking answers. Kimiko found herself increasingly in the questioning camp. The Americans, either intentionally or accidentally, accelerated the transformation. They brought in films to show the prisoners, documentaries about America, propaganda, yes, but also glimpses of a different world. The women watched footage of American cities, unscathed by war, filled with cars and electric lights and shops overflowing with goods. They saw American families sitting down to dinners that would have fed an entire Japanese village. They watched American women working in factories, voting, speaking their minds in public. Is this real? Yuki whispered during one film showing an American supermarket, its shelves packed with food. Or is this propaganda like ours? I think it's real, Sachiko answered. Look at the soldiers here. They have this casualness, this ease. They're not starving or desperate. They're well-fed and confident. That doesn't come from propaganda. It comes from genuine abundance. The films raised uncomfortable questions. If America was truly the struggling, desperate nation the Japanese government had described, where did this abundance come from? If American soldiers were supposed to be barely human savages, why did they waste resources treating enemy wounded and feeding prisoners? More unsettling were the English classes. A teacher, an American woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who had lived in Japan before the war, came to the camp twice a week to teach basic English. She was kind, patient, and she spoke to them as if they were students rather than prisoners. Language is a bridge, Mrs. Caldwell told them in careful Japanese. When you understand English, you can hear what Americans say without translation. You can judge for yourselves what is true. Kimiko attended every class. She soaked up vocabulary and grammar like a plant drinking water after a drought. And as her English improved, she began to have real conversations with the American staff. Private Johnson taught her the word friend, and asked if they could be friends despite everything. She'd said yes, surprising herself. Nurse Patterson taught her kindness and compassion, and explained that these were American values too, not just Japanese ones. Sergeant Martinez taught her respect, and showed her photographs of his Mexican-American family, explaining that America was made up of many different peoples, all living together. Not always perfectly, he admitted, but we try. Each conversation, each new word, each interaction built a more complex picture of America than the simple evil enemy narrative she'd been fed. One evening, as sunset painted the sky over Okinawa in shades of orange and purple, Kimiko sat with Sachiko outside their tent. The older woman had become a mentor of sorts, someone who seemed to have thought through the contradictions more deeply than most. "Sensei," Kimiko said, using the respectful term for teacher, "I'm confused about everything, about what we were taught, about what's true, about who I am now." Sachiko nodded slowly. "I know. We all are. But you seem calmer, more certain." "I'm not certain," Sachiko corrected. "But I've made peace with the uncertainty. Kimiko, do you know why I became a teacher?" Kimiko shook her head. "Because I believed education was the path to truth. That if we taught our children well, they would grow up wise and strong. But now I realize I was teaching them lies mixed with truth, and I didn't even know which was which." Sachiko pulled her knees up to her chest, looking younger than her 40 years. "The hardest thing I've had to accept is this. Our empire lied to us. Not about everything. Japanese culture has beauty and value. Our traditions matter. Our people are brave and honorable. Those things are real. But," Kimiko prompted, "but we were lied to about other things. About America. About the war. About the nature of honor and shame. We were told to value death over life, obedience over conscience, the state over the individual, and I think those were lies designed to make us easier to control." Kimiko felt her breath catch. These words, spoken aloud, could get them both killed if the wrong person heard. Even here, in an American POW camp, some prisoners clung so fiercely to the old beliefs that they might inform on anyone expressing such thoughts. "You're saying the Emperor I'm saying powerful men use beautiful ideas to justify terrible things," Sachiko interrupted gently. "They wrap cruelty in the language of honor. They call murder duty and oppression tradition. And we believe them because we wanted to believe, because it's easier to follow than to question." "But what do we do now?" Kimiko asked, her voice breaking. "If everything we believed was a lie, what's left?" Sachiko reached over and took Kimiko's hand. "We build something new. We take what was true and good from our old beliefs, the respect for others, the dedication, the courage, and we combine it with new truths we've learned. That enemies can be human. That mercy has value. That life is precious even, especially when it's difficult." "The Americans showed us that," Kimiko said softly. "Yes. And that's why this war was so dangerous for the Empire. Not because America had more weapons or better resources, though they did, but because American ideas are dangerous. The idea that individuals matter. That ordinary people deserve dignity. That governments should serve citizens, not the other way around." Kimiko thought about this for a long moment, watching the sun slip below the horizon. "If I accept these new ideas, does that make me less Japanese?" "No," Sachiko said firmly. "It makes you more human. And being human matters more than being Japanese or American or anything else. The nation you were born in is an accident. The person you choose to become, that's what defines you." Those words settled into Kimiko's heart like seeds. She wasn't less Japanese for questioning the Empire. She was more human for recognizing the humanity in her enemies. It was a profound shift, and she knew it would change everything. Yuki's physical recovery paralleled an emotional one. As her wound healed and her strength returned, she began volunteering in the camp kitchen. There she worked alongside American cooks and learned to make strange dishes: hamburgers, apple pie, mashed potatoes with gravy. One day she convinced the cooks to let her make onigiri, rice balls, using American rice. She added bits of canned fish and vegetables, shaped them with practiced hands, and wrapped them in paper. Then she distributed them to the Japanese prisoners and the American guards alike. The Americans were confused at first, but when they tasted the simple rice balls, their faces lit up. "Hey, this is good," one soldier exclaimed. "What do you call this?" "Onigiri," Yuki said shyly, her English improving. "Japanese food. You like?" "Like? This is delicious." And just like that, something shifted. The guards started requesting onigiri. Yuki started teaching the American cooks how to make it. Soon Japanese women were trading recipes with American soldiers, finding common ground in the universal language of food. Kimiko watched her friend bloom. The terrified, wounded woman from the cave had transformed into someone more confident, more open. Yuki laughed now, really laughed, something Kimiko hadn't heard since before Okinawa. "Are you happy?" Kimiko asked her one day, genuinely curious. Yuki paused, considering. "Not happy, exactly. I still worry about my family. I still feel guilty sometimes for being alive when so many died, but..." She smiled. "I'm not miserable either. And a few months ago I was certain I'd be dead. So maybe being not miserable is a kind of gift. The Americans gave us that gift, Kimiko observed. No, Yuki corrected. You gave me that gift. When you threw yourself over me and begged them to help. When you chose my life over your honor. That's what saved me. The Americans just followed through. Kimiko remembered that moment in the cave with crystal clarity. Yuki had been dying, and Kimiko had faced a choice. Watch her best friend die while maintaining the appearance of honor, or beg the enemy for help and shame them both. She'd chosen Yuki's life. At the time, it had felt like cowardice. Now, watching her friend smile and laugh and teach American soldiers to make rice balls, Kimiko understood it had been the bravest thing she'd ever done. We were taught that dying for the Emperor was the highest honor, Kimiko said softly. But I think living for the people we love might be harder, and maybe more honorable. Yuki's eyes filled with tears. She pulled Kimiko into a fierce hug. Thank you, she whispered, for saving my life, for being willing to carry the shame. Thank you. They stood like that for a long moment, two women who had walked through hell and emerged changed but not broken. Around them, the camp continued its strange routine, enemy soldiers and prisoners finding unexpected common ground in the aftermath of war. It wasn't the ending they'd been promised. It wasn't glorious or simple or clean, but it was real, and it was theirs. What the Japanese women didn't fully realize was that the American kindness was both genuine and strategic. In conversations with Nurse Patterson and Mrs. Caldwell, Kimiko gradually learned the reasoning behind their treatment. The brass figured out early that you catch more flies with honey, Nurse Patterson explained during one of their English lessons. Prisoners who are treated well give up valuable intelligence. They're less likely to cause trouble. And when word spreads that America treats POWs humanely, more enemy soldiers surrender instead of fighting to the death. So it's tactical? Kimiko asked, feeling a strange disappointment. She'd wanted to believe the kindness was pure. Yes and no, Mrs. Caldwell interjected. The strategy only works because there's real compassion behind it. American soldiers are taught the Geneva Conventions, yes, but most of them also grew up being told that even enemies deserve basic human rights. It's not just manipulation, it's what we actually believe. But some Americans are cruel, Yuki pointed out. They'd all seen it. Guards who looked at them with hatred, who enforced rules harshly, who clearly wished they could exact revenge for Pearl Harbor. Of course, Nurse Patterson agreed. Americans aren't saints. We're people. Some people are kind, some are cruel, most are in between. But our system, our government, our military structure, it tries to encourage the kindness and constrain the cruelty. It doesn't always work. But we try. This nuance was important. The Japanese women were learning that truth was rarely simple. America wasn't a nation of angels, any more than Japan was a nation of demons. Both countries had good people and bad people, wise leaders and foolish ones, moments of nobility and moments of shame. What mattered was the system. And the American system, for all its flaws, seemed to value individual human life in a way the Imperial Japanese system did not. Sergeant Martinez put it bluntly one day, "My country isn't perfect. We've got racism, poverty, corruption, all kinds of problems. But when an American soldier is wounded, we move heaven and earth to save him. We don't tell him to kill himself rather than be captured. We don't call his family shameful if he survives. That's the difference." That difference was everything. The climax came 3 months into their captivity, on a humid August morning that would change the world. Kimiko was working in the infirmary, rolling bandages and organizing medicine supplies when Sergeant Martinez burst in. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something between shock and disbelief. "Have you heard?" he asked Nurse Patterson. "They dropped it. The atomic bomb. On Hiroshima." The room went silent. Kimiko's hands froze mid-motion, a bandage unwinding from her fingers onto the floor. Hiroshima, her hometown, where her family lived. What is atomic bomb?" she asked, her English faltering in her panic. Martinez looked at her and she saw pity in his eyes. "It's a new weapon, incredibly powerful. It destroyed the entire city, everything, everyone." The world tilted. Kimiko gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. "My family," she whispered. "My mother, my father, my little brother." Nurse Patterson was at her side immediately, steadying her. "We don't know details yet. Some people survived. Maybe your family..." But Kimiko knew. She knew from the look in Martinez's eyes, from the hushed horror in Nurse Patterson's voice. Hiroshima was gone, which meant her family was gone. The father who had disowned her, the mother who had asked her not to write, the little brother who had been too young to understand why his sister was dead to them. All gone in an instant. She should have felt grief. She did feel grief. But twisted up with it was something darker. Relief. Relief that they were dead and would never know the shame of her survival. Relief that the letters would stop, that the guilt would end. And then, horrible and confusing, gratitude. Gratitude that she had been captured before the bomb fell. That she was here, safe in this camp, alive when everyone she'd known was dead. What kind of person felt grateful for such a thing? I need to sit down, she said faintly. They helped her to a chair. Someone brought water. The infirmary buzzed with shocked conversation as news spread through the camp. An American weapon so powerful it destroyed an entire city. What did this mean for the war? What did it mean for Japan? 3 days later, the Americans dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. And 6 days after that, Emperor Hirohito made a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese had ever heard his voice, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. The prisoners gathered around a radio, listening to the crackling broadcast. Many heard their emperor's voice for the first time. This man they'd been taught was a living god, speaking in formal, archaic Japanese about bearing the unbearable and enduring the unendurable. He was telling them to surrender, telling them their suffering had been for nothing, telling them to embrace the unthinkable. When the broadcast ended, silence fell over the Japanese women. Then one by one they began to cry. Not quiet tears, but wailing sobs of grief and relief and rage and confusion. All mixed together. Some cried for family lost, others for the shame of defeat, others for the sheer incomprehensible end of everything they'd known. Kimiko didn't cry. She sat very still, numb with shock, as the truth settled over her like a heavy blanket. Everything she'd been willing to die for was gone. The Empire had surrendered. The divine mission had failed. The officers who had told her to take cyanide rather than be captured had been wrong about everything. Wrong about honor, wrong about America, wrong about the war itself. She was alive. Hiroshima was destroyed. Japan had surrendered. And she sat in an American POW camp, healthy and fed and safe. Having survived what was supposed to be a fate worse than death, the contradictions finally crystallized into understanding. The Empire had been willing to sacrifice every Japanese person, every man, woman, and child, rather than admit defeat. They'd been preparing civilians to fight American invaders with bamboo spears. They'd rather see the entire nation destroyed than surrender. But the Americans, the supposed monsters, had tried to minimize Japanese casualties even as they won the war. They'd warned civilians to evacuate before bombing raids. They'd treated prisoners humanely even when they had every reason to seek revenge. And now, even in victory, they were distributing food and medicine to a conquered nation rather than letting it starve. Which side was truly more civilized? Which showed more respect for human life? Kimiko stood up, her legs shaky but her mind suddenly clear. She walked outside the infirmary tent and looked up at the Okinawan sky. It was a beautiful day, sunny and warm, with fluffy clouds drifting overhead. Birds sang. Life continued. Yuki found her there. Her friend's face was blotchy with tears, but there was also something like relief in her eyes. "It's over," Yuki said. "The war is over." "Yes." "What do we do now?" Kimiko took a deep breath. "We live. We survived the war, survived capture, survived the bombs. We live and we remember, and we tell the truth about what we learned here." The truth about Americans? The truth about humanity. That people are more complicated than propaganda. That mercy is possible even between enemies. That choosing life over death isn't shameful. It's brave. Yuki gripped her hand. "Your family is gone," Kimiko finished. "Because they believed the lies. Because the Empire valued honor over survival. Because no one was brave enough to say that maybe, just maybe, there are things more important than dying for your country." She thought of that moment in the cave when she'd thrown herself over Yuki's dying body and begged the Americans for help. At the time, it had felt like the most shameful thing she'd ever done. Now she understood it had been the most important. She'd chosen her friend's life over abstract notions of honor. She'd chosen humanity over ideology. And the Americans, those supposed devils, had responded with compassion. They'd saved Yuki. They'd saved Kimiko. They'd saved hundreds of Japanese prisoners who should have been their enemies, but whom they treated as human beings worthy of care. "I was wrong about everything," Kimiko said softly. "Everything I'd been taught, everything I believed. But I'm glad I was wrong. Because if I'd been right, Yuki, you'd be dead. And I'd have died in that cave, and for what? For an empire that would have let my family starve while telling them it was honorable?" Yuki pulled her into a hug, and they stood like that as the afternoon sun painted gold across the camp. Two women who had been taught to hate Americans, standing in an American prison camp, grateful to be alive. The truth, it turned out, was far more complicated and far more beautiful than propaganda had ever allowed for. And now they would have to figure out how to live with that truth. The days following Japan's surrender were chaotic. The POW camp, which had been a controlled environment, suddenly had to prepare for massive changes. Japanese prisoners would be repatriated, sent home to a defeated nation that many had not seen in years. For Kimiko, home no longer existed. Hiroshima was rubble. Her family was dead. The Japan she'd left no longer existed either. The divine emperor had admitted defeat, revealing himself to be mortal after all. The military government had collapsed. Everything that had structured Japanese society for decades was being dismantled. Some prisoners were eager to return despite everything. "It's still home," one woman said. "Still Japan, still ours." Others, like Kimiko, felt only dread. "What will we return to?" she asked Sachiko. "There's nothing left." "Then we'll build something new," Sachiko replied. "Japan survived centuries of isolation, then decades of modernization. We'll survive this too." But survival would be complicated. American forces were occupying Japan, implementing reforms, changing laws, rewriting the Constitution. The Americans they'd learned to trust in the camps would be their occupiers back home. How would that work? How would a proud nation accept defeat and foreign rule? The answer came gradually through conversations with American personnel who were preparing to ship out to Japan as part of the occupation force. "We're not there to punish you," Nurse Patterson explained to a group of prisoners. "We're there to help rebuild. To make sure Japan never starts another war like this, yes, but also to help your people recover, to establish democracy, to ensure you have food and medicine and the resources to build a better future." "Why?" one woman asked suspiciously. "Why would you help us after everything?" Sergeant Martinez answered this one. "Because that's what you do after a war. You don't grind your enemy into the dust. That just plants seeds for the next conflict. You help them rebuild, make them into partners instead of conquered subjects. We learned that lesson after the last World War. This time we're trying something different." It was a radical idea. Historically, conquerors extracted tribute from the conquered, but America was proposing something unprecedented, using their resources to rebuild their defeated enemy. Kimiko found herself wanting to believe it, even as part of her whispered that this was just more propaganda, a different flavor of lies to replace the old ones. But she'd learned to test ideas against reality. And the reality was that Americans had treated her with unexpected decency for months. Why would they suddenly become cruel now, in victory? As the weeks passed and the repatriation process began, the prisoners were given time to prepare. They attended classes on what to expect in occupied Japan. They were issued new clothes, simple but clean. They were given medical checkups to ensure they were healthy enough for travel. And they were offered counseling, though few took it. The idea of discussing emotions with strangers was foreign to their culture. Kimiko spent her time writing. She filled notebook after notebook with her experiences, her thoughts, her transformation from loyal imperial subject to something else. Something she still couldn't quite name. Japanese, yes, but also more than that. Human. Individual. Someone who had learned to think for herself. She wrote about Yuki's near death in the cave, about the American medic who saved her, about Private Johnson's chocolate and Nurse Patterson's combs. She wrote about the atomic bombs and her lost family. She wrote about propaganda and truth and the complicated nature of honor. "Why are you writing all this?" Yuki asked, watching her friend's pen move across page after page. "Because someone needs to remember the truth," Kimiko answered. "Not the propaganda version where Americans are demons or where surrender is shameful. The real truth. That enemies can show mercy. That sometimes living requires more courage than dying. That the people we were told to hate turned out to be more humane than our own leaders." "That's dangerous thinking in Japan," Yuki warned. "I know, but it's still true. And truth matters, even when it's dangerous, especially when it's dangerous." Sachiko, overhearing, came to sit with them. "When we return to Japan, there will be many who don't want to hear this truth. They'll cling to the old stories because change is frightening, but there will also be people ready to listen, ready to build something new." "How do you know?" Kimiko asked. "Because Japan has always been adaptable. We survived the arrival of Commodore Perry and the opening of Japan. We survived the Meiji Restoration. We'll survive this too, and we'll become something different, something that remembers the lessons of this war." "What lessons?" Yuki asked. Sachiko considered. "That military might without moral wisdom leads to destruction. That propaganda and censorship prevent a nation from seeing truth until it's too late. That individual human life has value beyond what it can sacrifice for the state. These are lessons bought with tremendous suffering. We owe it to all who died to remember them." Kimiko wrote that down too. These conversations were part of the truth that needed preserving. The day finally came when Kimiko and Yuki were scheduled to board a ship back to Japan. They packed their few belongings, the clean clothes given by Americans, the notebooks filled with writing, the small gifts from guards who had become something like friends. Private Johnson found them before they left. "I wanted to say goodbye," he said in his awkward Japanese. You changed how I see things. I came to Okinawa thinking all Japanese were fanatics who wanted to die. But you showed me different. You're just people, like us." Kimiko managed a smile despite the tears in her eyes. "You changed me too. You showed me that enemies can be friends. That kindness matters more than nationality." They shook hands, this American soldier and Japanese prisoner, two people who should have been simple enemies but had become complicated friends. Nurse Patterson gave them each a bag of medical supplies. "For your journey," she said, "and for when you get home. You'll need these." Sergeant Martinez gave them letters of reference, testifying to their work in the camp. "These might help," he said. "The occupation forces will need translators and nurses who understand both sides. You could be valuable." As they walked toward the trucks that would take them to the port, Kimiko looked back at the camp one last time. It had been a prison, yes, but it had also been the place where she'd learned to see beyond propaganda, where she discovered that survival could be honorable, where she'd watched her best friend brought back from the brink of death by people who owed them nothing. "Are you ready?" Yuki asked. "No," Kimiko answered honestly. "But I don't think anyone can be ready for what's coming. Japan will be unrecognizable. Everything will be different." "We'll be different too," Yuki pointed out. "We're not the same women who hid in that cave." That was true. The frightened girls who had expected torture and death were gone. In their place stood women who had learned hard truths about war, propaganda, and the complex nature of humanity. As the truck pulled away and the camp disappeared from view, Kimiko clutched her notebooks tighter. These pages held the truth, and somehow, someday, she would make sure that truth was heard. Years later, Kimiko would look back on those months in captivity as the most transformative of her life. More than nursing school, more than the war itself, more even than surviving the atomic bomb by being captured, she would tell her children, born in a rebuilt Japan, growing up in a democracy shaped by American influence, about the moment in the cave when she threw herself over Yuki and begged enemies for help. She would explain how that moment of choosing life over abstract honor had saved them both. She would describe the shock of American kindness, how it had undermined everything she'd been taught about the enemy, how soap and hot water and medical care had been more powerful than any weapon in destroying her faith in imperial propaganda. She would be honest about the complicated feelings, the guilt of surviving when so many died, the shame of captivity that never fully faded, the anger at leaders who had lied to her generation and sacrificed them for a pointless war. But she would also talk about hope, about how the Americans who occupied Japan after the war brought food when people were starving, medicine when disease was rampant, and eventually democracy that gave ordinary people a voice. They weren't perfect, no occupier is, but they tried to be fair. They kept their promises about rebuilding, and she would tell her children about friendship across enemy lines, about Private Johnson's chocolate and Nurse Patterson's combs and Sergeant Martinez's patience, about learning English and making onigiri for American soldiers and discovering that the enemy was just as human as she was. These stories would matter because they were true. Not the simplified truth of propaganda where one side is entirely good and the other entirely evil, but the complicated truth where both sides held humans capable of both cruelty and compassion. Yuki, who married an American occupation soldier and moved to Ohio, much to the shock of both their families, would also tell these stories. She would show people the scar from the shrapnel wound that should have killed her and explain how an American medic saved her life while his own soldiers lay dying nearby. Between them, they would keep the truth alive. The truth that in war, the bravest act might not be dying for your country, but living for your friends. That propaganda is most dangerous when it makes you stop seeing enemies as human. That mercy shown to those who don't deserve it can be more powerful than any weapon. These lessons, hard won and paid for in blood and suffering, would be their gift to the next generation. A generation that would build a different Japan, still Japanese in culture and spirit, but never again willing to sacrifice everything for imperial ambitions. And so the soap, the hot water, the chocolate bar, and the medical treatment became more than simple acts of basic human decency. They became proof that even enemies could choose compassion over cruelty. For Kimiko and Yuki, for Sachiko and all the women who survived those caves and camps, these small mercies represented something profound, the possibility of a different world. They had been taught that Americans were demons who would torture and kill them. Instead, they found flawed humans who tried, however imperfectly, to treat prisoners with dignity. They had been told that surrender meant shame worse than death. Instead, they discovered that survival required its own kind of courage. The courage to question what you'd been taught, to see beyond propaganda, to choose life even when death seemed honorable. Kimiko's choice in that cave, throwing herself over Yuki and begging American soldiers for help, embodied this courage. She chose her friend's life over abstract notions of honor. And the Americans responded not with cruelty but with compassion, saving both women and fundamentally changing how they understood the war, the enemy, and themselves. The atomic bombs that ended the war brought unimaginable destruction. Kimiko lost her family, her home, everything she'd known. But because she'd been captured, because she'd survived that moment in the cave, she lived to see peace, to help rebuild Japan, to tell the truth about what she'd learned. That truth? That people are more complicated than propaganda allows. That enemies can surprise you with kindness. That choosing life, even when it seems shameful, can be the bravest act of all. Years later, when Kimiko's daughter asked her what lesson she should take from her mother's war experience, Kimiko thought for a long time before answering. "Learn this," she finally said. Hatred is easy, it's comfortable and simple, but seeing the humanity in your enemy, that's hard. That requires courage, and that's the only way to ever have real peace. These are the stories that matter. These moments of unexpected compassion in the midst of horror remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there is hope. That even enemies can choose mercy. That kindness in the end is more powerful than hatred. If this story moved you, if you believe these forgotten moments of history deserve to be remembered, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with others. These truths about war, about humanity, about the complicated nature of honor and survival need to be passed on to new generations. Because the lesson Kimiko learned in that cave, the truth she carried for the rest of her life, is a lesson our world still needs to hear. We are all, regardless of nationality or circumstance, fundamentally human. And recognizing that humanity in others, even in enemies, is the first step toward a better world. Thank you for listening to this forgotten story from World War II. Remember to like, subscribe, and share these important historical accounts with others who care about understanding the complicated truth of human conflict and compassion.